The most influential voice in podcasting sits in a chair that feels foreign after years of commanding his own studio kingdom. Joe Rogan built an empire on curiosity, on asking questions that traditional media wouldn't ask. But questions became weapons when wielded without wisdom, and curiosity became conspiracy when filtered through confirmation bias. The man who turned a basement hobby into a $100 million Spotify deal now faces a reckoning that no amount of money can buy his way out of. For 3 years, his podcast served as ground zero for COVID misinformation, a platform where dangerous medical advice masqueraded as intellectual courage and vaccine hesitancy was rebranded as independent thinking. Across from him sits Piers Morgan, a man who has made careers out of extracting truth from those who prefer comfortable lies. Tonight's confrontation has been months in the making. Rogan's team repeatedly declining interviews, then demanding editorial control, then finally agreeing to appear after mounting pressure from Spotify executives who are tired of defending the indefensible. The studio is sterile compared to Rogan's Austin compound, where elk meat and DMT stories flow as freely as the conversations. Here, under professional lighting that shows every line of stress on his face, there's no artificial atmosphere to hide behind. No loyal audience of comedians and fighters to validate his worldview. Just two men, cameras, and a mountain of evidence about the consequences of unchecked influence. On Piers's desk lies documentation that reads like a medical examiner's report. CDC studies on vaccine misinformation, hospital data correlating podcast episodes with treatment requests, screenshots of dangerous medical advice given to millions of impressionable listeners, and testimonials from doctors who have watched patients die while clutching printouts of Rogan's recommendations. This isn't just entertainment industry drama. This is a public health tribunal, conducted in front of a global audience that has watched America's response to the pandemic fracture along the lines of who people chose to trust. Misinformation, medical experts, or a former Fear Factor host who admits to eating horse dewormer. The silence before the storm lasts exactly 19 seconds before Piers Morgan fires the opening shot that will define the next 2 hours. Joe, Piers begins, his voice carrying the measured authority of a prosecutor who has spent months building an airtight case. Let's start with something simple. Do you believe you have a responsibility to fact-check medical information before sharing it with 11 million listeners? Rogan shifts in his chair, immediately recognizing the trap embedded in the question. Answer yes, and he admits negligence in spreading misinformation. Answer no, and he appears recklessly indifferent to public health. That's a loaded question, man, Rogan responds, falling back on his signature deflection technique. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm a comedian who talks to interesting people and shares my thoughts. I've never claimed to be an authority on anything. The disclaimer is so well rehearsed it sounds like a legal document. But Piers Morgan has heard variations of this defense from every irresponsible media figure he's ever interviewed. You may not claim authority, Joe, but you wield it. Piers counters smoothly. When you tell 11 million people that young, healthy individuals don't need vaccines, that's not comedy. That's medical advice. When you promote ivermectin as a COVID treatment, that's not conversation. That's pharmaceutical recommendation. Each example hits with surgical precision. Rogan's face tightens as his most controversial statements are transformed from casual conversations into documented medical misinformation. I was sharing my personal experience. Rogan protests, his voice gaining the passionate intensity that has made him famous. I got COVID. I took ivermectin. I got better. That's not misinformation. That's my actual experience. Your personal experience, Piers repeats slowly. presented to millions of people as evidence that ivermectin works, despite every credible study showing it's ineffective against COVID. Do you see the problem with that? The distinction between anecdotal evidence and scientific proof is being drawn in real time, forcing Rogan to confront the difference between personal experience and public recommendation. I also took monoclonal antibodies, vitamin D, zinc. I threw everything at it. Rogan admits, seemingly unaware that he's undermining his own argument. But the media only focused on ivermectin because it fit their narrative about horse dewormer. Horse dewormer? Piers echoes. You mean because ivermectin is literally an antiparasitic drug primarily used in veterinary medicine, and people were buying the animal version from feed stores because human prescriptions required doctor approval? The factual correction lands hard, and Rogan's expression suggests he's never had his talking points challenged so directly. There are human versions of ivermectin, he protests weakly. Prescribed for parasites, not viruses. Piers responds immediately. And yet you presented it as a viable COVID treatment to millions of listeners who trust your recommendations more than their own doctors. The conversation is barely 10 minutes old, and already Rogan's defensive walls are showing cracks. Look, Piers, Rogan says, leaning forward with renewed energy. I've always encouraged people to talk to their doctors. I've said repeatedly that I'm not giving medical advice. I'm sharing information and experiences. Have you? Piers reaches for his folder. Because I have transcripts here where you explicitly told listeners not to get vaccinated if they're young and healthy. Where you called vaccines experimental gene therapy. Where you suggested that natural immunity was superior to vaccination without any scientific basis. Each quote is delivered with devastating precision, transforming Rogan's casual conversations into documented medical misinformation. I was questioning the narrative. You were undermining public health. Piers interrupts sharply. There's a difference between asking legitimate questions and promoting dangerous conspiracy theories. The accusation of conspiracy theorizing clearly stings, touching on Rogan's sensitivity about being lumped in with fringe voices, despite hosting many of them. I've had doctors on my show, Rogan protests. Real doctors with different perspectives. Dr. Robert Malone, Dr. Peter McCullough. These are credentialed professionals. Outlier doctors whose views have been rejected by every major medical institution. Piers corrects. You presented fringe opinions as legitimate alternatives to scientific consensus, giving dangerous misinformation the veneer of credibility. The pattern of platforming discredited experts while ignoring mainstream science is being exposed in real time. So, only doctors who agree with the CDC should be allowed to speak. Rogan challenges, attempting to reframe censorship as open inquiry. Doctors whose positions are supported by evidence should be given more weight than those promoting debunked treatments. Piers responds. That's not censorship. That's responsible journalism. The distinction between legitimate debate and false balance is crystallizing, and Rogan looks increasingly uncomfortable with the implications. Let's talk about your questioning methodology, Piers continues, pulling out a thick research folder. Because you claim to be just asking questions. But there's a pattern to which questions you ask and which experts you trust. Rogan's eyes focus on the folder as if it contains evidence of crimes he doesn't remember committing. Which, in many ways, it does. When Dr. Anthony Fauci recommended masks, you questioned his motives and credentials. When Dr. Robert Malone, who was banned from Twitter for misinformation, came on your show, you accepted his claims without skepticism. Why the different standards? The double standard is laid bare with uncomfortable clarity. Rogan shifts visibly as his unconscious bias is exposed. Fauci changed his positions multiple times. Rogan responds defensively. First, no masks, then 2 masks. People lost trust in him because he seemed inconsistent. Scientific understanding evolved as we learned more about a novel virus. Piers counters. That's how science works. You update recommendations based on new evidence. Why did you interpret adaptation as deception? The question cuts to the heart of how conspiracy thinking operates. Interpreting normal scientific processes as evidence of manipulation. Because it felt like they were moving the goalposts. Rogan admits, his voice carrying genuine frustration. People want clear, consistent information, not constantly changing guidelines. And you provided that clarity by promoting ivermectin and vaccine skepticism? I provided alternative perspectives that weren't being discussed in mainstream media. Alternative to scientific consensus, Piers clarifies. Let me read you something. This is from Dr. Jennifer Walker, head of emergency medicine at Houston Methodist Hospital. The introduction of specific testimony from medical professionals shifts the conversation from abstract debate to concrete consequences. During the summer of 2021, after your episodes promoting ivermectin, we saw a 400% increase in patients requesting the drug. We had to explain repeatedly that it wouldn't help with COVID, that it could cause serious side effects, that they were endangering themselves based on podcast medical advice. The statistics hit like physical blows. Rogan's face goes pale as the direct line from his content to emergency room visits becomes undeniable. We had patients who delayed seeking proper treatment because they believed ivermectin would cure them. Piers continues reading. Some of them died while waiting for a livestock dewormer to save their lives. I never told people not to seek medical treatment, Rogan protests, but his voice lacks conviction. You told them to distrust medical authorities and promoted unproven treatments. What did you think would happen? The question forces Rogan to confront the predictable consequences of his rhetoric rather than hiding behind unintended outcomes. I thought I was helping people make informed decisions. Informed by what? By cherry-picked studies, discredited doctors, and your personal anecdotes? Piers's voice rises with genuine indignation. That's not information. That's misinformation dressed up as independent thinking. The mask is being torn away from Rogan's self-perception as an honest broker of diverse viewpoints. There's something else, Piers says, pulling out another document. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. They tracked vaccination rates among different demographic groups and correlated them with media consumption. Rogan's eyes lock onto the paper as if it contains his Judgment Day verdict. Young men who regularly consume podcast content, your primary demographic, had vaccination rates 23% lower than the general population. Your influence is measurable, Joe, and it's measurably harmful. The statistical correlation between Rogan's content and vaccine hesitancy is devastating evidence of his impact. Correlation isn't causation. Rogan responds weakly, falling back on the standard defense of conspiracy theorists everywhere. Multiple studies controlling for education, income, geography, and political affiliation all point to the same conclusion. Podcast misinformation is a significant factor in vaccine hesitancy among young men. The scientific rigor being applied to measure Rogan's influence exposes the hollowness of his deflections. Even if that's true, Rogan says quietly, I was expressing honest skepticism about policies that seemed inconsistent and treatments that seemed rushed. Honest skepticism, Piers repeats. Is that what you call it when you ignore overwhelming scientific evidence in favor of fringe theories that confirm your pre-existing biases? Piers reaches for his tablet, and the change in Rogan's demeanor is immediate and dramatic. The casual confidence that has carried him through thousands of podcast episodes evaporates as he prepares to confront the human cost of his influence. "I want to show you something, Joe," Piers says, his voice taking on the gravity of a judge reading death sentences. These are stories from people whose lives were directly affected by COVID misinformation. The screen reflects off Rogan's face as he's forced to look at testimonials from real people rather than abstract statistics. This is Marcus Rodriguez, 34 years old, from Austin, your own city. Piers begins reading. He was a regular listener who decided against vaccination after hearing your show. He died of COVID in September 2021, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. The specificity makes it impossible to dismiss as abstract harm. This isn't a statistic. It's a name, an age, a family destroyed. His wife Sarah wrote to your show multiple times, begging you to clarify that you weren't giving medical advice. You never responded. The personal appeal ignored makes Rogan's negligence feel actively cruel rather than passively irresponsible. "I get thousands of messages," Rogan protests weakly. "I can't respond to everyone." "You can respond to the widow of someone who died following advice they heard on your show," Piers shoots back. "That's not everyone. That's the bare minimum of human decency." The moral failure is laid bare in terms so simple that no rationalization can obscure it. Here's another one. Piers continues relentlessly. Dr. Patricia Chen, a pediatric nurse in Denver. She wrote to explain how your comments about children not needing vaccines led to a measles outbreak at her hospital. The expansion from COVID to other vaccine-preventable diseases shows the broader consequences of undermining vaccine confidence. 17 children hospitalized, 2 with permanent brain damage, because parents who trusted your medical skepticism decided their kids didn't need experimental vaccines that have been safely used for decades. Each detail adds weight to the mounting evidence of harm caused by Rogan's influence. "I never talked about childhood vaccines," Rogan protests. "You talked about vaccine skepticism in general, about not trusting medical authorities, about doing your own research," Piers counters. "You think that message doesn't carry over to other medical decisions?" The systemic nature of vaccine hesitancy, once seeded, becomes clear as Rogan is forced to confront the broader implications of his rhetoric. "There's more," Piers says, scrolling through the tablet. Emma Thompson, 28, pregnant, decided against COVID vaccination after hearing your show discuss pregnancy risks that don't exist in actual medical literature. The vulnerability of pregnant women to misinformation makes this case particularly heartbreaking. She died of COVID at 32 weeks. Her baby survived, but will grow up without a mother because she trusted a podcast over her obstetrician. The image of a motherless child growing up because of medical misinformation hits Rogan like a physical blow. "Stop," he whispers. But Piers continues. Hospital workers in rural Texas report that patients regularly quote your show when refusing treatment. Joe Rogan says, has become the preface to medical non-compliance that kills people. The direct quotes from dying patients make Rogan's influence undeniably concrete and lethal. How many people have to die, Joe, before you acknowledge that your honest questions have dishonest consequences? The question hangs in the air, like an accusation that cannot be answered without admitting moral culpability. Rogan breaks down completely, his shoulders shaking as the scope of unintended harm becomes undeniable. "I never wanted anyone to die," he sobs. I was just trying to have conversations about things that seemed confusing and contradictory." But people did die. Piers responds gently but firmly. And they died, at least in part because they trusted your confusion over medical expertise. Joe, Piers says, his voice taking on an almost therapeutic quality as Rogan continues to process the human cost of his influence. I want you to help me understand something. You've built your career on curiosity, on exploring ideas that others won't touch. When did healthy skepticism become dangerous misinformation? The question is designed to help Rogan understand his own journey rather than just attacking his conclusions. Rogan wipes his eyes, trying to compose himself enough to engage with the psychological excavation Piers is conducting. I think it started when I felt like I was being lied to. He begins slowly. The initial messages about COVID seemed inconsistent. The lab leak theory was dismissed as conspiracy, then became plausible. Natural immunity was ignored, then acknowledged. So you lost trust in institutions? I lost trust in the idea that there was only one acceptable viewpoint on complex issues. Rogan clarifies. And when you're skeptical of official narratives, you start giving more credence to alternative voices. The psychology of radicalization is being mapped in real time. How institutional mistrust leads to embrace of fringe sources. But Joe, there's a difference between skepticism and contrarianism. Skepticism follows evidence. Contrarianism rejects consensus regardless of evidence quality. The distinction is crucial because it separates legitimate inquiry from reflexive opposition. I thought I was being skeptical, Rogan admits. But looking back, maybe I was just being contrary. Maybe I was so invested in questioning authority that I stopped questioning the people who were telling me what I wanted to hear. The self-awareness is striking. Recognition that his skepticism had become selective and self-serving. When Dr. Malone told you that vaccines were dangerous, did you fact-check his claims? Not really. It felt true, you know. It aligned with my instincts about pharmaceutical companies and government overreach. But when mainstream doctors presented evidence that vaccines were safe and effective, you questioned their motives? Because I thought they were part of a system that benefits from compliance. Rogan explains, revealing the conspiracy thinking that undermined his judgment. So you trusted the doctor who told you what you wanted to hear and distrusted the thousands who didn't? The logical fallacy is stated so simply that its absurdity becomes undeniable. When you put it like that, it sounds insane, Rogan admits. It doesn't just sound insane, Joe. It is insane. And it's dangerous when someone with your influence operates from that kind of logic. The progression from personal bias to public harm is traced with devastating clarity. What should I have done differently? You should have recognized that expertise matters, that your instincts about complex medical issues aren't as valuable as the collective knowledge of people who've spent their lives studying infectious diseases. But experts can be wrong too. Individual experts can be wrong, Piers acknowledges. But when the overwhelming majority of experts reach the same conclusion based on multiple independent studies, the probability of error approaches zero. The difference between individual fallibility and institutional reliability is explained in terms even a conspiracy theorist can understand. You treated scientific consensus, like political opinion, as if all viewpoints were equally valid regardless of evidence quality. That's not intellectual courage. That's intellectual cowardice disguised as rebellion. The psychological analysis cuts to the core of Rogan's self-image as a truth-teller willing to challenge authority. I thought I was fighting groupthink. You were participating in it, just a different group, one that happened to be wrong about almost everything. As the interview approaches its climax, Piers asks the question that will determine whether this confrontation leads to transformation or merely catharsis. Joe, what are you going to do now that you understand the harm your platform has caused? Rogan straightens in his chair, seeming to find solid ground for the first time in hours. I'm going to completely change how I handle medical topics, he says with quiet determination. No more giving platforms to discredited doctors without rigorous fact-checking. No more presenting fringe theories as legitimate alternatives to scientific consensus. The commitment represents a fundamental shift in his approach to platforming controversial guests. How? I'm hiring actual medical advisors, real experts who will review any health-related content before it airs. If someone comes on claiming vaccines cause autism or COVID is a hoax, they'll be fact-checked in real time. The willingness to submit to external oversight represents a dramatic change for someone who has prided himself on editorial independence. What about the content you've already produced? The millions of downloads of episodes containing dangerous misinformation. I'm going to add disclaimers to every episode that discussed medical topics, directing people to consult actual doctors rather than podcast hosts. And I'm donating substantial money to vaccine education programs. The retroactive responsibility for past harm shows recognition that accountability requires action, not just apology. How much money? $25 million to start. To fund medical literacy programs, to support hospitals dealing with misinformation-related problems, to help families affected by vaccine hesitancy. The financial commitment adds weight to his other promises and represents a meaningful portion of his Spotify earnings. What about your audience? Many of your listeners have built their worldview around the ideas you've promoted. They're not going to accept this change easily. Then I'll lose some of them, Rogan responds without hesitation. I'd rather have a smaller audience that trusts accurate information than a larger one that believes dangerous lies. The willingness to sacrifice audience for accuracy represents perhaps the most significant transformation possible for a content creator. Some people will say this is too little, too late, that the damage to public health, to institutional trust, to social cohesion is irreversible. They might be right, Rogan admits. Some damage might be permanent, but the alternative to trying to fix it is accepting that it stays broken. Why should people believe this transformation is genuine, rather than just damage control after bad publicity? Rogan turns directly toward the camera, addressing his global audience with evident sincerity. Because I've seen the faces of people who died believing things I said. I've read letters from their families. I can't take that back, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. The direct acknowledgement of personal responsibility for deaths is perhaps the strongest possible evidence of genuine transformation. If you're listening to this and you've made medical decisions based on my show, please talk to real doctors. Please get vaccinated if they recommend it. Please don't let my mistakes compound into more tragedy. The direct appeal to his audience to ignore his previous advice shows complete rejection of his former position. What do you want people to take away from this conversation? That influence without expertise is dangerous. That asking questions isn't valuable if you ignore the answers. That when you have millions of listeners, your responsibility to accuracy outweighs your right to speculation. Each lesson learned is stated with the clarity of hard-won wisdom. And finally, that it's possible to be completely wrong about important things and still find a way back to serving truth rather than ego. But it requires admitting error, accepting guidance from actual experts, and putting public good ahead of personal brand. As the interview concludes, Joe Rogan sits transformed, from defensive conspiracy amplifier to chastened advocate for expertise and accountability. Whether this transformation proves lasting, whether his audience accepts his new direction, whether the damage to public health can be repaired. These questions can only be answered by sustained action over time. But in this studio, on this night, one of the most influential voices in digital media offered something rare in podcast culture: complete accountability, recognition of expertise beyond personal experience, and commitment to accuracy over entertainment. The silence that follows contains both the weight of lives lost and the possibility of lives saved through the responsible use of unprecedented influence. Some platforms become forces for good. Others become weapons of mass destruction. Tonight, Joe Rogan chose which legacy he wants to leave behind.